steeds onveiliger. Niet eens zozeer op straat. Ik vind de islam een achterlijke cultuur en ik vind dat ik dat zeg, maar ik vind christendom in principe ook een achterlijke cultuur, hoor. Ik maak er geen onderscheid in, maar ik vind dat ik dat zeg, maar als ongelovige hond.
I remember very well the day that Theo van Gogh was murdered at broad daylight in the morning in the streets of Amsterdam. His throat was cut, his knife was planted in his chest.
I think he shot him, went over his body, started stabbing him, and as he's stabbing him, Theo van Gogh is saying, "Can we talk about this?"
Not only was a knife plunged into his heart with a note, and in that note, of course, naming Ali as his next potential victim, but he was near decapitated, and that was because he, in some way, shape or form, criticized Islam.
Everybody in Holland knew Theo van Gogh's position, not just on Islam, but on all religions, and I think we underestimated the fact that he would be murdered the way he was.
He didn't think of even taking a knife and stabbing him back or whatever. Just accept it. Can we talk about this?
He made a film, Submission, with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and the objective of the film, in my mind, was to highlight the Muslim oppression of women under Islam, gender apartheid.
Theo van Gogh and I met in 2003. He called me after the election and said, "I voted for you," and asked how he could help. And at that point, I had worked on this submission project.
This was Ayaan's idea to have an installation at a museum, and she had already secured the space.
And Theo van Gogh said, why do you want to put this in a museum? We could do it as a film and we'll hide the faces of the women. And so we did that, and he really wanted, he was used to provoking almost everyone in the Netherlands. He was a well-known provocateur, but for him the project of submission was a project of charity to the women of Islam. He understood Islam in a way that the other elite in the Netherlands, or most of the elite, did not. He understood that it was a force for evil, and that it could really come and overwhelm us unless we push back and fight back.
This is a woman who lived it. You can't tell Ayaan. You can't preach to Ayaan. You can't tell her what Islam is or Islam isn't, or what it really is or what it really means. She was raised devout Muslim. She was a victim of its traditions and mores. And clearly, the movie was a way for her to communicate her subjugation, her oppression.
I compared these women to sun. I said they're used as sun factories. You bring immigrant men from outside the country, you give them to a young woman of 15, 16, and she's only required to have babies, little baby machines. And so I wanted to talk about not just what was done to the women. They were beaten, they were raped, they were forced into marriages, they were subjected to female genital mutilation, all this in the Netherlands. And I didn't want to just talk about these practices and how harmful they are. I also wanted to address the principles that make the practice widespread, and that moves it from generation to generation and from place to place. At that point, when submission was made and Theo van Gogh was killed, I had 24-hour protection. My threats against me started way back in 2001 and 2002, and he was killed on November 2, 2004, and I always argue that's because he didn't have security detail or the kind of security detail I had.
I think that Ayan and Theo were aware of the danger. I don't know if Theo understood how imminent it was, considering his last words. Theo van Gogh's last words best express the West's sort of naivety, sweetness, and stupidity. Can we talk about this?
I think, can we talk about this? Is exactly where to start.
As Muhammad Bouyeri has just shot him and is trying to behead him, and he says, can't we talk about this? That the West is in the mode of thinking that we can deal with these people who are absolutely intransigent and they will not be dealt with on a rational basis. They don't want to talk about this. They will not talk about this. They want us to stop talking about this. They want us to just do their bidding. Contrast that with Muhammad Atta, one of the 19 hijackers on September 11th, 2001. When he got control of the airplane that he flew into the World Trade Center, he told the passengers, he told them, stay quiet and you'll be okay.
Stay quiet and you'll be okay. When he knows he's going to fly a plane into that building and kill everyone on that plane and kill people in that building.
They did stay quiet. They didn't rise up and throw him out of the cockpit and crash the plane like they did on Flight 93 in the Pennsylvania field. They stayed quiet, but they were not okay. They crashed into the building and they all died. Stay quiet and you'll be okay is what the Islamic world is saying to us now. And we're saying to them, can't we talk about this? And they're saying, no, stay quiet and you'll be okay.
I don't find, sit down and please be quiet, Islam is saying that. I don't find that reassuring.
This is a culture whose default position is just, you can't talk about it.
So if there's a free speech problem around Islam, of course it starts with Islam, which is an intensely prescriptive theocracy.
The fundamentalists have chosen their targets well, and they've chosen them wisely, because they know that if they stop that first chink in the wall, if it just, that first little bit of the wall that starts to come down, the whole thing comes crumbling. That's what they know, and they're not wrong.
And so they want to silence any form of reflection or critical thinking on Islamic law, because if they do that, so many Muslims will walk out.
If we stay quiet, they will see that they can get us to do what they want by means of threats. And that will mean there will just be more threats and more imposition of more Sharia norms until we are completely subjugated under Islamic law.
This is why they immigrate also, because immigration is extremely important for dawah, for conversion, because it is written in the Quran that that Islamic law must dominate the whole world. It is a command. They are not doing jihad because they love jihad. It is written in the Quran, you hate the war, but it is command to you.
Of course it starts with Islam, which is a highly controlling religion, the most controlling of all the world religions.
It is forbidden to the Muslim to follow their ways, to integrate, to accept them as friends. So this is the problem.
And Islam, in a sense, is using the laws of liberal progressivism for a much more profound purpose.
Can we talk about this in the context of the Netherlands and maybe in the rest of the wider West? Can we talk about this means, we are civilized people. We can disagree, and we should sometimes agree to disagree, but we don't use violence to make a point.
February 14th, 1989, when the Islamic Republic of Iran started all this off.
On a very particular date, which is Valentine's Day, 1989, when the news came from Iran that a British novelist, Salman Rushdie, was sentenced to death, the calls for his murder by a foreign cleric, Ayatollah Khomeini, for the crime of writing the novel The Satanic Verses.
Which was based on an incident that Islamic tradition relates in the life of Muhammad when he got a revelation that there were 3 goddesses, daughters of Allah, who were the goddesses of the Quraysh tribe that he came from and that had rejected him. Once he said that the 3 goddesses were real goddesses, then they accepted him as a prophet, and everybody was happy until he realized that he had compromised his message of absolute monotheism and contradicted himself. So he went back to them and said, well, actually Satan inspired those verses, and I was all wrong. I was inspired by Satan, which of course challenges or destroys his entire claim to be a prophet. If he could be inspired by Satan once, maybe the whole thing was inspired by Satan.
When Muhammad was preaching in Mecca, and the people he was preaching to, the Meccans, the polytheists, refused to buy into his message. Those who mocked him and he rejected his faith, he said, persecuted him. So this persecution mania that you see every time, Muslims being the victim, whether they are the perpetrators or not, they are always the victim. This is baked into the faith. If you reject Islam, you're persecuting Muslims.
When Salman Rushdie published the Satanic Verses and the fatwa emanated from the Ayatollah of Iran
to have him murdered at the first sign that any Muslim gets their hands on him, to make him pay for mocking Islam.
I think it was so shocking to the world, and it was rebuked by Margaret Thatcher, and Salman Rushdie was turned into a bit of a celebrity figure in the West. He was given around-the-clock protection.
In those days, the West still had some understanding of the necessity of the freedom of speech, and there was quite a lot of outrage even on the left.
I think that was a strong response in some ways, standing with freedom of speech, but there wasn't a push back.
The problem that politicians have with this is that this is, on one level, beyond their realm. I mean, from Satanic Verses onwards, this was about novel writing. Soon it became about cartoons.
And George Bush Sr. was weak and limp, when the fact is, if we said, if he is harmed in any way whatsoever, is a member of Western civilization, you're going to pay a price for it.
With the political elite, unfortunately, not so much has changed. You know, they are shocked, they say the right things sometimes, and after 3 weeks they are totally uninterested anymore.
But people didn't think this was going to be a new thing. I don't think people saw that was the start of a series of events.
The Satanic Verses affair from 1989 onwards had a very interesting result. On the one hand, Salman Rushdie stayed alive. He was protected by the British states on the order of the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. But people internalized the fatwa, and British writers stepped back from doing it again.
You know, they soon learned, you know, thou shalt not criticize Islam. You know, this is basically adhering to Sharia blasphemy laws.
And so every one of these events that ratcheted up fatwas against free speech, I don't think people realized at the time that that was sort of the first ditch in the battle, maybe the second ditch, the third ditch. And it's always easiest to fight in the first ditch as opposed to the last ditch.
There's a fatwa, and there's something even more, where even if the person who puts the fatwa on the individual, even if he dies, it's still active. So he's still on the run. Who knows how he lives life.
Salman Rushdie actually turned up on some West London radio station one night and announced that he'd reconverted to Islam. And the Ayatollah said, hey, good to hear that, but we're still going to kill you. You'll have a better shot at paradise, but we're still going to kill you. And that's conscious, that they don't want you to recant.
Imagine what any other group in society could do if they said, you know, they had a head-hacking unit somewhere in the background, don't have anything to do with them, but, you know, can't promise if you offend me.
What they want is a state of fear, so that when people are thinking, can I get away with this cartoon or can I not get away with this cartoon? Can I get away with this novel or can I not get away with this novel? That in the end, you'll abandon those kind of calculations entirely and just steer clear.
The West capitulated. They basically gave credence to the threat, to the complaint of the Ayatollah and Muslims around the world. And they were like, well, you shouldn't have written that.
This is a timidity born of the Rushdie affair. The desperate fear that politicians as well as writers have, that if they just go that little bit too far, they're standing on the edge of a cliff, and if they just leaned even a little bit further forward, they might go over entirely. I've had that expressed to me by many writers.
Salman Rushdie would never get to the fatwa now. He'd never have to worry about the fatwa, because he'd send that book to his publisher, and the publisher would say, well, thanks a lot, old boy, but frankly, I'd rather not. Why don't you just do something about, say, 3 North London novelists sitting around a dinner table chit-chatting? That's much more our cup of tea. Don't bother writing about any of this Islamic stuff. That self-censorship, backed up by the state thought police, is actually having a worse effect on freedom of speech.
It is important that since we have millions of Muslims among us, that we know their religion. It is very important.
The San Bernardino shooters, the Garland jihadis, the Boston bombers, the Manchester bombers, and others have all been active in their mosques. What is taught there?
Most of the countries in the Middle East are different. The Shia country is not a Sunni country. That Jordan is not to be compared with Oman, but they all have one thing in common, and that is Islam. And I saw that Islam, at the end of the day, Islam and democracy, Islam and freedom are incompatible. And I saw that without saying that all Muslims are wrong or non-democratic. I saw that the culture and the ideology they bring along was not there to integrate or assimilate.
If you live in a Muslim society, you know, the moments of being self and with yourself are stolen moments. First of all, let's start with the belief itself in being a Muslim. You're so under control. I don't know if you know the terms commanding right and forbidding wrong. So every Muslim is policing every other Muslim to make sure that they actually believe.
Totalitarianism means that you are not allowed to leave. And a Christian can leave Christianity. A Jew can leave Judaism. A Buddhist can leave Buddhism. But a Muslim is not allowed to leave Islam. The penalty is death. And it was the same with other totalitarian ideologies we saw in the last century when it comes to communism, when it comes to fascism. So I learned that in the process that Islam, even though it's dressed up as a religion, was more to be compared not with other real religions, but with other totalitarian ideologies.
Now you tell me any society, Muslim majority society, or any household or community, where as a Muslim you can stand up and disagree with Muhammad's teachings. That's when I say there's no sense of self. If you have that kind of disagreement, you have to keep it to yourself, or you have to suffer the consequences of being killed, or hellfire, or it is a religion of fear.
As it were, taking the fundamentalists at face value, they have chosen their targets well, and they've chosen them very well, because, as I say, go for Salman Rushdie, go for the novelist, go for the cartoonist, go for the newspaper, go for the only few people willing not to shut themselves up, and everybody will shut themselves up.
In the fall of 2005, a Danish author, Kare Blutgen, wanted to do a children's illustrated Quran, but he couldn't find anyone to illustrate it. Sort of like a child's illustrated Bible. He wanted to do that for a Quran.
There was a school teacher who had a book written about Muhammad for Muslim students. It was his integration project, and he was looking for illustrators. He couldn't find illustrators.
And so the story of him not being able to find anyone to illustrate it, because everyone was afraid of the wrath of Muslims, like, it might be some fatwa like against Salman Rushdie. So that became a little bit of a news story. And then as a symbolic act of the separation of mosque and state and free speech, a Danish newspaper, the Jyllands-Posten, said, all right, we're going to prove we're free men and women. We're going to publish any cartoon of Muhammad. And they wrote to all the editorial cartoonists in the country.
And some of those illustrations were absolutely not negative about the Prophet Muhammad. They were in fact making fun of the newspaper that commissioned the illustrations.
And there was no natural reaction to this. No one cared really. But then some imams went on sort of a world anger tour, shopping these cartoons around in Egypt and other countries, trying to get a reaction. Again, there was no reaction. In fact, one of the cartoons was published in a newspaper in Egypt. No one cared.
They were published in 2000, in the fall of 2005, and the riots didn't start until early February, I believe, of 2006. So these weren't riots. These were protests that were set in place.
Because a Danish imam had taken them around in the Islamic world and added some really offensive ones too, which had never run in the paper.
Muhammad with a pig nose, like an imam Muhammad with a pig nose, was drawn by a Danish imam to make the cartoons look worse than they were. But he didn't get into trouble.
Then the OIC latched onto the cartoons. They decided to make this into a means by which they could challenge the freedom of speech.
It wasn't until the Organization of Islamic Cooperation met in Saudi Arabia in late 2005 where it was decided that there would be a cartoon jihad.
The Organization of Islamic Cooperation is 56 nations plus the Palestinian Authority. It's the largest voting bloc at the UN since the demise of the Soviet bloc. And so it essentially calls the shots at the UN. What they want, they get.
And they are steering the UN towards basically bringing around a global blasphemy law against any criticism of Islam all across the Western world.
The good cop, bad cop routine then kicked in with riots and killings of innocent people over these cartoons. And meanwhile, the OIC is saying, see, this is your fault. You've stirred up these people.
Syria was fingered by the UN for killing the president of Lebanon. And Iran got offside with world opinion on nuclear matters. So both of those countries had a reason to change the channel. That's sort of dictatorship 101, have an external distracting enemy to blame. So all of a sudden there were spontaneous riots in Damascus and in Tehran, two countries that really don't allow spontaneous freedom of association political rallies. And they burnt down the Danish embassy in Damascus. And so these two dictatorships, Iran and Syria, used this cartoon issue as a pretext for, oh my God, we're the victims and the evil crusaders. And by the time February 2006 came around, there were riots around the world, including in Nigeria, more than 200 Christians killed in anti-cartoon riots by people who obviously had not seen these cartoons. I mean, they ran in a newspaper in Denmark.
Many Muslims around the world still saying the root cause of this conflict remains unresolved. So the world awoke this morning with more fighting, pitched battles in the streets in Indonesia, in India, in Afghanistan, and beyond. This has been going on now for some 12 days.
These countries that allowed their citizens to protest about cartoons in some foreign, faraway country don't allow their citizens to protest for, when they have no water or electricity or the basic or freedoms. When they don't have the basic needs that a government should give them, they're not allowed to protest. But they were encouraged to protest against this. So this was all set up.
And the West fell for it, and it largely agreed and said we have to, and the newspapers declined to publish the cartoons even when they were writing news stories about the incidents, the riots, the whole thing.
And what happened then was incredible. I mean, various Muslim countries' embassies threatened economic boycotts on Denmark. It was an international scandal. And instead of standing up to Muslim censorship, like the West, like Margaret Thatcher did in the case of Salman Rushdie, this time the West caved in. And not just governments, but so many media around the West declined to show the cartoons as if they were so obscene that they could not be shown to Western audiences.
When people say that drawing cartoons of Muhammad is disrespectful to Muslims, I say, no, you are being disrespectful to Muslims. Because if you agree that drawings or cartoons of Jesus or Moses or whatever is sacred to other people, that those non-Muslims have the maturity and the sanity not to respond with violence, you are in fact implying that Muslims can only respond in one way. So those people who come up and say, oh, I'm protecting Muslims, they really don't know that they're engaged in the racism of low expectations.
2005, after the Danish cartoons controversy began. And by the way, one should always bear in mind how ridiculous it is we're still talking about the cartoon controversy. If you'd have said in 1999, Douglas, in the 21st century, you're all going to be having a really big cartoon controversy. What? What are you talking about? What? Walt Disney's gone nuts? What's the problem going to be? I can't foresee any. Your crystal ball's gone wrong. You need to polish it. It's nuts that we talk about the cartoon controversy and keep a straight face. But when the cartoon controversy started in Denmark, a famous case of the Danish Prime Minister Rasmussen had a delegation of imams and religious leaders who wanted to meet him and complain about the Jyllands-Posten and cartoons. And Rasmussen famously said, nothing to say to them. Tell them to go away. They're going to have to learn that Denmark is a free country with a free press that is separate from the government. And if they don't know that now, they're going to have to learn it, and the sooner the better. I think that's one of the most heroic, obvious, but heroic things of recent years, and it wasn't done enough.
You saw embassies burning, you saw people being killed, and that was the time that every newspaper and every newscast in the West should have run those cartoons, because you can't kill everybody. Once they ceded that point, it is the Western elites who are at fault, who have blood on their hands.
They were able to go after Charlie Hebdo, they were able to go after Pamela Geller, they were able to go after Ezra Levant in the Canadian courts, because not enough people shared the risk.
And so those mass moments of collective cowardice, submission, and silence, I think, changed the Western culture far more than the attack on 9/11. And the thing is, so many ordinary Canadians, Americans, Europeans don't even know that that was changed, because they just won't hear a story. Before, maybe a story would have been so shocking and it would have been reported, but now an editor says, oh, is a Muslim name, skip it.
People always say, we want to open a dialogue with the Muslim world, or we must have interfaith dialogue, we must have dialogue with Muslim leaders and Muslim people. What would you be able to do to start this dialogue? Cartoons, obviously, not a great start apparently. So maybe a novel. Oh, Salman Rushdie tried that. We all know what happened. Maybe you could write an article. Oh, well, Rediker in France did that and had to go into hiding, as have others elsewhere across the continent. So there's always this idea that that if you just stop that happening, then it'll be okay. And they don't realise that the people who go nuts today for the cartoon will go bananas tomorrow over the book, will go crazy a day later over the article,